Hi folks, I am Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix.
You can go back even to the, as I say, the main societies that stuck their head up. They probably always existed in under one name or another, but they put their head up in the 1800s, and that was when the big push to really forward the Darwinistic theories came along, which was to dispel all ideas of the old gods and old religions and bring in a scientific dictatorship type of system where we would be trained by experts and we would believe the experts the way we used to believe what priests said. And that has happened. And it was Professor Thomas Huxley, who was the best friend of Charles Darwin, who picked certain people to be authors that would be made to be famous, like H.G. Wells in the 1800s. And he predicted the whole setup for the 1900s. They talked about creating a system of free love to destroy the last vestiges of the tribal system, which was marriage between man and wife, and how they would separate the children from the adults, and the state would bring up the children under a scientific formula where the children would become basically almost robotized wards of the state. They would do what they were told. The whole thing was to dominate what they called inferior types, those with less IQs, and they believed, being Darwinists, that they had the right, because of the superiority of intellect and wealth, to run the planet and direct the planet as they pleased. Their biggest problem were the masses who might object, so they'd have to train the masses in different ways without the public being aware they were being trained, and that their ideas that they would have, their opinions they would hold and even fight for, were not actually their opinions. They'd been marketed right into their minds. And you'll find that's happened today. But they wrote lots of books about this from the top, the main players. Right up through the 1900s, we have many of the major players that helped formulate this system and actually have brought us to where we are today, writing about it in their own memoirs in the early 1900s onwards.
Maybe in case we have new listeners, because there's always new people that come on board and they're probably saying, what in the world is he talking about? What is eugenics? Explain to, in your own words, what eugenics is, so that maybe some of our new listeners would have an idea of what in the heck are we dealing with here?
Well, it burst forth from the writings of Charles Darwin. Darwin did not come out with anything new. He was simply put there at the right time by a big, powerful group and the Royal Society in England to manifest into the public's mind an idea where science would overthrow, again, religion and bring in a sort of a humanist agenda where there was nothing out there except more humans, and here's all humans are. We're just simply evolved species of animals, and to get us to believe that we are just animals. If we could believe that, we'd throw out the door the rights, the sacred rights of the individual, being a sacred person with a spirit and so on. If they could nullify that and bring in nothing but materialism, then we would allow ourselves in the future to be managed by specialists. That was part of the whole agenda. And out of it came superior types of humans, inferior types of humans, because it was an incredibly arrogantly snobbish idea. The U.S., for instance, brought out this eugenics program funded by the Rockefellers. They funded the whole thing into existence in the U.S. They ran and put forth bills in the Congress which had forced sterilization for what they called the feeble-minded. And many people could be classified as feeble under their very wide definitions. And they even had their own magazine out where they showed you superior families. They'd have photographs and superior family of the month. So this stuff did not begin in Nazi Germany. It began really in London and then in the United States of America. And eugenics truly believes, as Charles Darwin wrote in the 1950s, 1952 or 3, in his book, The Next Million Years, on behalf of the Eugenics Society, he said, if we don't eliminate the inferior, the unfit, the mentally unfit, he said they'll overtake us by their breeding, and we basically would wipe them out. So their idea was that they had better wipe us out first. by all and every means possible. When Charles Darwin was presented to the public with, it wasn't his theory and on a doctrine really of evolution, it was already done by his grandfather. It was republished in a sense. They dressed it up at the Royal Society. In fact, the Royal Society chose to give Charles Darwin the credit for the theory over Wallace, who in fact had done most of the legwork across the planet and suffered the malaria and all the rest of it, to try and back up this theory, this quest. But they gave it to Charles, as I say. Now, the Royal Society is a very important organization. You cannot call anything royal in Britain or the British Commonwealth, which is just the empire, unless you're given a charter by royalty itself to use that term. And in the Royal Society, as I said, it goes back for hundreds of years, which initially was a Freemasonic scientific society. A very interesting one in that, because when you were asked to join, you had to give up any family you had to join it and be a member. You had to put your wife to the side and leave her with family and give them enough money to support themselves, supposedly, that's what they say, and join it. There was a fraternity. Because what they were up to was a plan to guide world commonwealth into existence, and also to basically control the masses, the herd, as they saw it. And all famous players that came out, Sir Isaac Newton and others, were members of this, became members of this society. Bacon himself had to join it, and he did put his wife away. He left her to get this great, incredible honor. And what they do in there is discuss the future in terms that would never be used in polite society, because they can say things and do things that's contrary to good manners, you might say, or even to human decency, because it's all about eugenics and guiding the world, and topics like culling off people that are inferior, and so on and so on and so on. It's very secretive. And at one time it was barred to all female scientists, and eventually when they had the right ones in the 20th century who were also taught eugenics and believed in it, they started to bring in female scientists as well. But what is this great belief in eugenics that these guys had? Well, you see, in Charles Galton and Charles Darwin's day, they were already practicing eugenics in certain families, very intense inbreeding. And even though they had many offspring with genetic deformities and problems, and many of them died very young or at birth even, it was always for the one who survived that they said it was worth it, because the one who survived would have the traits of the parents. You find that the Darwin family only intermarried for generations with the Wedgwood family, the famous pottery company that they owned in England. Intense inbreeding. And you can find more on this particular topic in a book. It's called Darwin and the New World Order by Ian Taylor, an excellent book which debunks a lot of their science. In fact, well worth the read. You see, the big boys and all the different scientists and scientific professions into sociology and so on had really claimed in the 19th and 20th century that the old ways of doing things were just leftover refuse, if you like, of bygone orders of religion. Things like marriages and having children and people having the rights to decide what they want to do in life, etc., was just too untidy. And they wanted to bring in a planned society. And that really is the reason they brought out Charles Darwin. They wheeled him out at the right time. Darwin himself was no genius. He came from a lineage where his grandfather, he had even written a book about evolution. And the rest of the stuff he simply took from Wallace. But it was the Royal Society, the high Freemasonic society, that deals with science. It's still very big today. If you want to get anywhere in science, you have to be a member, and a Masonic member, by the way, because you're sworn to secrecy. then it was them that picked Darwin to be the champion for this new phase. It would be a phase. It was the right time to bring it in, to put the last nail in the coffin of religions. And therefore the age of reason was to truly start to prevail. But it would also mean that a gap would be left. You see, a gap, because the public, the masses, if you like, had always had some ideal to follow, whether it was religious or if it was a philosophic idea. And in religion, too, I include Marxism. It was definitely a belief system, if you truly understand it. And it came from a man whose father was a rabbi, so he really transposed a very old religion into Marxism, which became communism. And it's no coincidence that the exact same goals of communism match up with the goals of the Pope of Freemasonry, Albert Pike, who trained many people, including Mazzini, who took over him to start the World Revolutionary Party. And then after that, it was given to a man called Lenin, and we all know what happened there. All tied together, you see, because these people truly thought through their philosophies. They were ultimately really enlightened. They were way past the superstition, as they call them, of religions, although they would still use religion to bring in a new age. Tavistock was using wires in people's brains back in the early 1900s. Huxley was part of that. He went there often as a member and observed it. He thought it was just great.
And he was indeed an author as well.
Yeah. And he was descended from Thomas Huxley, who championed Darwinian theories. He was the best pal of Darwin. And that's another part of the story of this selective breeding. I mean, people don't realize that Darwin himself was one of quite a few families at that time that were selectively picking their mates. Charles Darwin's grandfather married only from the Wedgwood family, the big pottery company. And so
right.
His father married a Wedgwood. He married a Wedgwood. And when his wife died, he married his mother's sister.
All in the family.
And so this has been going on, this selective breeding.
Right.
And his grandfather had written The Actual Origin of Species before he did himself. And that was the first proclamation of a hidden religion, in fact, that had been here and you can trace back for thousands of years. Nothing happens by chance. But both systems, the West and the East, took a lot of their knowledge, at least they used the knowledge of Charles Darwin to do with the survival of the fittest. And both of them went through an industrial era where, for the first time, people were looked upon as the masses. That's the term they put out there. And everyone started parroting the masses, the mass. And individualism, as I say, was gone. You were not treated like an individual human being. You were simply part of the collective, no matter how special you thought you were yourself. Now, here's an article about Charles Darwin. I've talked before how all the big totalitarianists since Darwin's day have used his supposed theories, and they weren't his, to do what the nasty things that they did, including the boys who run the world today, bringing the population down and getting all the wrong types off the world, you know. And it's from the Sunday Times, November the 8th, 2009. Charles Darwin and the Children of the Evolution. The naturalist outraged the church, prompting a bitter debate that still sets creationists against evolutionists. Now a sinister link has emerged between his work and the recent spate of high school killings by crazed nihilistic teenagers. It's interesting, this. Since you wouldn't know from the celebrations of Charles Darwin's life this year, that's all over television, this sort of dramatic, fictional form, that the amiable Victorian gent portrayed in those TV drama docs pottering around the garden of his home in Kent has been fingered as a racist, an apologist for genocide, and the inspiration of a string of psychopathic killers. The Darwin double, and I should put in the Optimum Population Trust and all the other big ones, like Sir Crispin Tickle, Prince Charles' buddy, who's got a department on the British government now, saying they've got to lower the, bring down the population drastic, especially all the wrong kinds, meaning the working classes.
The Darwin double anniversary marks both the bicentennial of his birth and the 150 years since the first publication of On the Origin of Species, has featured much vanilla hoopla. The Royal Mail issued commemorative stamps. Damien Hirst designed the dust jacket, blah, 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 about all the different things that they did. With hardly a mention that his name has been associated with some of the world's most infamous crimes of modern history. It's as though there'd been an unspoken agreement to accentuate the positive. Well, there is an agreement, and it's spoken about, but it's in places called clubs. I'm off to my club in London, you see, club. Certainly, the milquetoast Darwin, played by Paul Bettany on the recent film Creation, provided little hint there might be a dark side to the great man's bequest to posterity. The film focuses on Darwin's inner conflicts in the years leading up to the publication of On the Origin of Species. The scientist is reluctant to make his ideas public, not because he's foreseen dire social consequences, but chiefly because he fears that the theory of evolution will upset his wife and the Church of England, which is all bogus because that was the intention of it. In America, where Darwin's writings on morality and race have become under particularly intense critical scrutiny because of the enduring creationist debate, he's been accused of fostering moral nihilism and scientific racism, and even of promoting an ethic that found its ultimate expression in the Holocaust. Most startling of all, a connection has now been drawn between Darwin's theories and a rash of school shootings. In April, 1,000 people gathered at sunset in Littleton, Colorado, to commemorate the victims of the Columbine High School massacre 10 years on. Darrell Scott, whose daughter Rachel was the first of the 13 children to be murdered, and whose son Craig narrowly escaped being shot, cannot understand why so little attention has been paid to the motivation of the killers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, and their interest in Charles Darwin's ideas. You can also tie that in, by the way, before I go on, with the murderers. I think it was in Harvard back in the 30s, maybe 20s or 30s, by a couple of the richest students on the planet to do with the Kuhn-Loeb Company. I think it was Leopold Loeb, and there's actually, they've been put movies out about them. They believed in Charles Darwin, and even believed it from their professor, who also taught Darwinism, that the ultra-rich, the elite ruling class had the right to commit murder, but not the people below them. They had a privilege to commit murder. Anyway, it says here, and by the way, they did it. It says here, Harris wore a natural selection T-shirt, the killer, right, on the day of the killings. Natural selection. Right? They made remarks on video about helping out the process of natural selection by eliminating the weak. This is these killers. They also professed that they had evolved to a higher level than their classmates. I was amazed at the frequent references to evolution and that the press completely ignored that aspect of the tapes. Much of the evidence remains sealed under a court order issued to minimize the risk of copycat killings, but from those documents that are in the public domain, it's clear that Eric Harris fantasized about putting everyone into a violent computer game that only the fittest could survive. Don't you think that's what it's all about in the first place, computer games? You didn't know that, did you? And like Darwin himself, he noted how vaccination might be interfering with nature's weeding process, weeding out the weak. In his rantings, Harris said he wished there were no vaccines or even warning labels on dangerous goods and let natural selection take its course. All the fat, ugly, retarded, crippled, dumbass, stupid something heads in the world would die. Maybe then the human race can actually be proud of itself, he said. As attorney for the families of the 6 of the students killed at Columbine, the Denver lawyer Barry Arrington has come across more in a similar vein. I read through every single page of Eric Harris's journals. I listened to all of the audio tapes and watched the videotapes. It became evident to me that Harris consciously saw his actions as logically arising from what he'd learned about evolution. Darwinism served as his personal intellectual rationale for what he did. There cannot be the slightest doubt that Harris was a worshipper of Darwin and saw himself as acting on Darwinian principles. And I should say, too, that anyone who really is into the Darwin, truly believes in it, is capable of all this stuff, too. And these are the guys at the bottom. Now, imagine that the Crispin Tickle boys at the top with Ultimate Population Trust and all the other big trusts up there working for the foundations and telling government they're going to bring down the population. They have the power to do it on a larger scale. You better really take this stuff seriously, because they're doing it, you see. And by the way, they've been using injections not to save you, but to bring you down. They've even discussed it. I've given you the quotes from Lord Bertrand Russell and others. He says we shall use a needle and put stuff in the food, put stuff in the water. It says here, in 2007, detectives following up a tip-off about a planned school shooting in Pennsylvania discovered that their suspect often logged on to a social networking site called Natural Selection's Army, and a number of related chat rooms that were later tagged by the media as a cyber school for killers. Cyber school for killers. These sites were quickly shut down by their service providers, but today Natural Selection is the name of a popular computer game in which competing teams attempt to annihilate one another, a sign that Darwin's term is still associated by many teenagers with sudden and extreme violence. Natural Selection T-shirts have proved a popular line through web-based outlets, and it seems that the Columbine killers have spawned a gruesome personality cult. There's even a computer game in which players adopt the roles of Harris and Klebold, which features original CCTV footage of the killings. This is amongst those reported to have frequented the original Natural Selection's Army website was an 18-year-old Finnish student, Pekka Erik Uvinen. On November the 7th, 2007, in Tuusula, Finland, Uvinen forced his head teacher, to kneel down in front of him before he shot her with his pistol. He slaughtered a further 7 victims before turning the gun on himself. Some of the Jukela High School students afterwards described the way Uvinen prowled through the building, pointing his gun at people's heads. Sometimes he squeezed a trigger and killed them. Sometimes, after looking long and hard through his sights, he would suddenly turn away and let his terrified targets go free. One witness said he seemed to be choosing his victims at random, but in fact he was making a very deliberate selection. He was trying to weed out the unfit. Before he embarked on his shooting spree, Uvinen posted a lengthy apologia on the internet, styling himself a social Darwinist, just like Crispin Tickle, Sir Crispin Tickle, and all these top boys that have the power, and, I should say, Mr. Rockefeller, who was on about it too, and Sir Charles Galton Darwin, that wrote The Next Million Years, the descendant of Charles Darwin, who said the very same thing: they've got to kill off the unfit, or they'll outbreed the fit, like himself. Read the book yourself.
They cover every possible base. It's just astonishing how science and the top scientists are employed by these people to go over, with their big think tanks, to go over every possible scenario that could possibly happen to ensure what they call survival of the race. And when they say survival of the race, they're not talking about you. And I remember too, I've gone over this scenario so many times, where Darwin, who was put forward by the Royal Society, a Masonic scientific organization that was given a charter to exist on behalf of the Crown, whose first project, by the way, was to make a glass beehive in the grounds in the house that they used for their experiments, to study how the perfect system would be, to study the bees. That represented, of course, humanity itself, where your queens and kings, or really queens at the top. I guess they're all queens now, but anyway, in one sense or another, and the drones, the type of priests, and then, of course, all the workers down below, and how everything was so well organized, everyone knew their job, and that there were no dead weight was carried. Anything that was infirm was simply killed off, stung to death, or tossed out the hive, whatever it was. That's the perfect society that they go by. And Darwin also gave the idea that of an example of an oak tree, for instance. He says that before the oak tree can grow, or even that acorn can take roots there, microorganisms have to come into the area. Before the animals might graze over it, take up the grass, in come the organisms, even some fungus at times too, and prepares that soil, and worms come in, insects come in, they all come and go in little waves, then they get eaten up too. In other words, everything gets eaten up in turn after it's done its job in order for that acorn to grow and or take seed. Now, a root. Now, the thing is too, he's talking about humanity. Because you see, they go through their histories in their own fashion with their own archives. And they talk about slavery existing in all generations, in one form or another. The great Charles Darwin, relative of Charles Darwin, in the 1950s, he was a physicist, worked on the Manhattan Project. He came out and said the same thing too. That there's been, in his own book, The Next Million Years, you can find it there. He said there's always been slavery in one form or another, and we are now in the process of creating a more sophisticated form of slavery. It's actually called democracy, if you haven't figured that out, where you think you've got rights and stuff like that. But it's really a system where specialists will decide everything for you through government agencies and laws and fines and force, if need be. That's what he's really talking about. From myself, Alan Watt. This good night to me, your God or your gods go with you.